Doug Rohan's back on the mountain to talk about the new ACC settlement.
Lawsuits, realignment, and settlements are always in the news. So we're back on the big mountain with a very special guest.
Hey, great to have you back here on the mountain. Crazy news dropping here yesterday about a proposed settlement for the ACC, FSU, and Clemson lawsuits. And here today, we have approval of the settlement by all parties. Fortunate enough to have Doug Rohan be able to join us at this very important point in time for both the ACC and his FSU Seminoles. So let's get right into the discussion. And back with us is Doug Rohan with Rohan Law. It's great to have you back here on the mountain to talk about this massive news for the ACC.
Thanks, guys. It's a real pleasure to be here. As I was telling TJ earlier, it's kind of a little bittersweet because I've been on here to be the litigation expert, and now that the litigation is wrapping up, we'll have to come up with some other excuse as to why I need to be on your show. But you guys have done just such a great job over the last year that we've been meeting together like this, and it's an honor to be on your show and to share some of our thoughts.
Really appreciate that. It's an honor to have you on our show, and I guaranteed we will continue to have things to talk about, no doubt about that. But let's get right into it. Our time is short. I know we all have things we have to get done here today. Thank you for jumping on, again, within 24 hours of the reporting and then within just a few hours of it being official. Want to hear from you, your first thoughts when these reports came out yesterday, kind of what were you thinking? And then we'll get into a little bit more of the details that we've learned here today. But what were your initial thoughts here, Doug?
This, for a settlement, for a joint agreement to suspend, to terminate the litigation, is as close to a total victory as I could have imagined. I tweeted out in a couple points that I was shocked at where the numbers ended up in terms of the resolution. Of course, I'm a homer. I'll remind your viewers, this is a full-throated Florida State appreciation. There are some Florida State fans who are very sad that the Alabama home opener this year is not a conference game. But that was never a realistic likelihood in terms of resolving this case. We knew the litigation was going to drag out years. I've stated on many shows, yours included, that the February 1st opt-in date was going to be a huge factor in when this case was going to be resolved. I was personally disappointed that we didn't announce a resolution January 31st. But on the shows that I did go on at the beginning of February, I said, there's no way ESPN is entering this agreement without at least a memorandum and understanding of what this settlement is going to look like. There's a lot of moving pieces. There's a lot of papers to draft. There's a lot of votes to take. There's a lot of meetings to schedule. And here we are now 35 days later with an agreement that essentially gives Florida State almost everything it wanted.
Yeah, we said yesterday we did a kind of a breaking news, if you want to call that, episode. And as you know, we like to do deeper dives in this stuff. So eventually we'll get to those deeper dive episodes. Maybe can have you back on when we can digest this, obviously, a lot more than we have now. But let's get into some of the details, because I agree with you. I mean, I've been a little bit, as I've been called by some of our dwellers, the ACC guy. I'm not a homer because I don't follow the ACC, but the ACC guy, I've kind of leaned a little bit more towards what they have put in their filings. Not that I didn't understand it. Steve, Mr. Neutral, and of course we have you on to give the FSU flavor. And I'm with you, though, when I saw these numbers, even yesterday, the 200, 100 that was talked about, I'm like, that's pretty good settlement, I think, for the members that are looking to, have options. And then today it comes out that I think we're talking 165 here, kind of day one, if you will, and then it kind of slowly goes down from that to under the 100 million. So, my opinion on the 165, we had heard 200 yesterday, and then 165 comes out today, and I'm thinking that is substantially lower than 200. And when we talked, it was kind of like, we'll see what happens. But my opinion is it really opens the door here, I think, in terms of what you're getting. And the biggest thing is it's the exit fees plus maintaining your media rights. And that was really, to me, for FSU, it's like, what happens to our media rights? How do we maintain and keep our media rights? That's the biggest thing to me in this entire situation. There would always be an exit fee, right? I mean, nobody's going to get out scot-free. But what were your initial thoughts there, Steve?
Well, I'd love to hear Doug's take
Okay.
on, Doug, you mentioned the extension there that went through at the end of January and February, the ESPN extending the ACC deal. We did see recently the Florida Supreme Court. I don't know if you'd call it made a decision, but basically decide to go forward, keep the case going forward in the state of Florida. So I'm interested on what your hunch is. Whenever there's a settlement like this, there's usually something, the dam breaks, something that kind of pushes it to one side or the other. And like you mentioned, this was almost complete capitulation by the ACC side. Florida State, Clemson getting almost everything they wanted. So do you feel like it was the case moving forward, pressure from ESPN? What do you think was just the impetus to kind of move in this direction where, I mean, this settlement is almost completely one-sided?
Somebody had asked that question yesterday. How much did the discovery play a role in this? I would say if we go back about a year ago, and again, all these shows are recorded, so feel free to fact check me and go check it out. But I think on one of the first times that we talked, it was after the second amended complaint was issued. And I had said, look, litigation moves at a snail's pace and everybody appeals everybody's decision where they don't win and it goes through the processes. But I did mention that there was no way the ACC, after seeing Florida State come out with those daggers in the second amended complaint, whether they were viable legal arguments or not, they were very transparent in what they were coming for. They wanted the jugular of the decision makers back in the preceding ACC administration. Nobody on that side wanted to be subjected to a deposition. I wouldn't go so far as to say it was a coincidence, because it wasn't a coincidence that next week is when the ACC depositions were going to take place, but it aligned consistently with where we knew the litigation would be at this point and the ACC opt-in. That's where I had seized up on about a year ago when we learned about that second amended complaint describing the opt-in. I said that's going to be the greatest pressure point. Is it 60-40? Is it 70-30? I can't tell you, specifically what was the driving force between those two. But yes, in conjunction, those two are the points that gave me a lot of confidence that this early springtime, late winter springtime in 2025 was when this was going to get wrapped up.
And I have two questions. I don't want to take all the time, but my first one is going to be about ESPN's potential involvement in this, which then will lead me to my second question, that being the grant of rights. So let's start with ESPN. And if you think, again, this is speculative. We did see them, especially in North Carolina, they came out and said, hey, you got to keep this sucker under lock and key. We've known what's been happening there with the ACC. We've talked about all of that. How much do you believe ESPN was a part of massaging, maneuvering, mediating, if you will, some of these ongoings?
I would like to look at the evidence, Your Honor, and present that for your consideration. There were 3 ESPN reporters that had the scoop on this deal that was had. I think that's all you need to point to when discussing whether or not ESPN was involved. There's no question that prior to ESPN committing for the next 9 years to a conference and their broadcast rights, that they had to have assurances. And that's why I said there was a framework, there was an outline of how this was going to get resolved. I might even go a step further. Again, speculation, no inside info. You can't sue me. This is an opinion. I would not be shocked if between the Big Ten and the ACC or SEC, those parties and those partners have already decided how they're going to break down the members who are leaving. Who are the principal departures? Who are the travel partners? What is this going to look like? And so from the ACC's perspective, I had to laugh today, now we're seeing the bottom half of the ACC talk about the feckless leadership of the ACC and how incompetent they are. Welcome to the party. We've been telling you about this since 1996. So yes, everybody else now agrees the ACC was in a difficult spot. And for their survival, for their long-term success, they took the guarantee. they took the assurance of knowing, look, we don't know what the conference is going to look like in 2040, but we want there to be a conference in
Right.
2040. And this resolution, this solution to the litigation was their most likely path to longevity. Now, do they look more like the AAC, or do they survive as a second tier conference alongside the Big 12? That remains to be seen. It depends on who they backfill. And let me take a step back. Florida State still needs to leave to go to one of the other conferences. But when you look at the viewership numbers, when you look at the brand, again, Homer as charged, I have to believe between the Big Ten and the SEC, one of them wants Clemson. At least one of them wants Florida State. At least one of them wants UNC. At least one of them wants Miami. Where they end up, we have to worry about the AAU membership. We have to worry about a host of other considerations. I do believe Florida State is leaving, and they're leaving before 2030. So ACC needs to find partners, whether that's USF, Memphis, Tulane. They need to backfill those with secondary characters that can still provide a valuable commodity that they can sell to ESPN and the broadcast partners.
Yeah, well said. We have done several, many, maybe an overstatement, but several realignment episodes. For those that may be new to the channel, we just dropped one in January that dives really deep into that, especially around UNC and what's been coming out here with the Carolina Blue Matter and all that kind of jazz. So if you're interested in that, a lot of that came from Steve's Big Ten sources, but we talk about some of that. So I do want to get into the grant of rights. This ironclad, thou shalt not break. It is stronger than any man-made substance known. And I got to get your feel for this, because here, I'm going to give you my take real quick. My take is based on this settlement, and I think you can spin it two ways. The one way you can spin it is, hey, they didn't break the grant of rights. They still have them. The document still stands. And I think at a high level, that's true. I mean, they didn't break the grant of rights. However, they have dramatically changed, at least with the ACC. And I'm not going to go to the Big 12 or anybody else that has a grant of rights, but they've changed the entire environment between a grant of rights and the membership agreement, the bylaws, all that kind of stuff. And I think this is given a fairly big blow to this ironclad grant of rights. I'd love to hear from you both in terms of the document itself for the ACC, and also maybe, the impact that may have over the entirety of, college athletics and other conferences using grant of rights.
That really is a fantastic question. And it comes down to attorneys enjoying exploring new and novel concepts. When it comes to property law, when it comes to contract law, we're talking about some concepts and some ideas that stretch back to the Magna Carta. And they've been litigated and refined and reviewed and addressed. And nothing new is under the sun, because we have a 200-year history in this country of going to court and analyzing these terms and these concepts. The grant of rights was created out of whole cloth and is a new practice area with very limited case law. Attorneys rely on case law to interpret and analyze the likelihood of success should a matter go to litigation. And one of the very important things that attorneys have to consider when advising their clients is, don't make bad case law. Maybe you think you're going to win, but if we go to this trial and we fight this for the next 3 years and we're stubborn and say this is absolutely ironclad and we lose, now nobody gets to use the concept of a grant of rights. Now it's invalidated. Right. So by preserving, to your point exactly, by preserving the idea that it's at least enforceable as a memorandum of understanding, if not a fully fledged contract, that's something that will allow conferences to continue to use it in the future. Whereas if a judge had ruled that this was void, nobody would get to use any grant of rights across any of the conferences.
Okay. That was kind of where I was headed. Like, this is from a conference standpoint, globally, a win, because the grant, to your point, the grant of rights still stands. Again, the ironcladness can be debated, but the document still stands.
So Doug, I have a kind of a two-part follow-up for you. Really FSU specific, but then the second part is kind of attorney centered. So first of all, FSU, I got to follow up because you said you thought they would be gone by 2030 or before 2030. With the structure, as you're seeing the details now, seems like it's basically widely reported and publicly, displayed in the Clemson and FSU board meetings today, what the numbers are that they can get out at 165 million now, or, I think it's what, 75 million after 2030. Do you see, what's your personal hunch on FSU? I put out on Twitter and we were kind of discussing on this. I think it makes sense for them to stay around to 2030. That lines up with the Big Ten's media rights, which kind of gives them, it's always great when you can have two bidders, hopefully two conferences that want you and are fighting over you. So the timing seems right. They know they have certainty of when they can leave, what the amount is. They can get some extra money between now and then. So that's kind of my take. I want to know what your hunch is on, will they have the patience to wait that long, or is it just bust out of jail free right now and maybe play independent for a couple years? And then the second part, is there any sadness that we don't get to see this as an attorney, as a litigator, that we do not get to see this whole thing play out? Because for me, I always tried to pin you down on the federal questions and all of that, constitutional questions of, public institutions with the grant of rights. And I thought this was a perfect test case in the state of Florida, sovereign immunity, all that stuff. So give us your take on how quickly Florida State will be out, and then are you sad not as a Florida State fan, but as a litigator, that we don't get to see the case play out to the end?
Well, I saw your tweet and I was hoping you would bring it up because I do want to massage a few details into your conclusions about the timing of it. I personally believe that with the negotiations occurring in 2030, that the conference would rather have the member in the fold prior to those negotiations taking place. And if it takes a year for those negotiations to take place, that really means they're starting to talk in 2029. So I think that if it's the Big Ten, they would want Florida State playing a Big Ten season by no later than 2028. And so that would mean that we would announce our departure 2027 prior to August 15th, or even 2026 to make it a more smooth transition. And then more importantly than all of this that we've discussed so far, because we know the number and we know what the buyout is and we know what the rights are and who has them, we can start talking to people now openly. This doesn't have to be cloak and dagger secret behind closed doors because of a risk of tortious interference where the original number was $536 million that they would get sued for. So I know some Florida State fans, again, are disappointed that Bama isn't a conference game this fall. That was never realistic. Best case scenario is 2026. Now we're talking about perhaps exploring and discussing and announcing a departure in 2026 or 2027. I think that's the most reasonable time frame for this to play out. And if it is the Big Ten, which I go back and forth, I have reasons for wanting Big Ten versus the SEC. But if some people are to believe, Florida State still has to achieve AAU status. We're not there yet. We're close. Florida State has doubled their medical research year over year over year. We need to double it one more time. We need to double it one more time. And then we're in the threshold, the stratosphere of where the AAU wants their member institutions to be. So that takes at least 2 more years before we get to that threshold level for us then to be invited in at some point a year or 2 later. So I could see AAU status still taking 2 to 3 to 4 years more before we gain it. So if we want to be in the Big Ten by 2028, it does line up very well. Geographically, the SEC makes more sense. As a season ticket holder, I would love to see Mississippi State come to town and Ole Miss come to town and Tennessee come to town. I would love to be able to go to Auburn and Jordan-Hare Stadium. I mean, it would be a dream scenario for an SEC schedule to fill my mailbox when we get our season tickets in 2028. But there is also the financial consideration and the academic consideration. And when it comes down to these presidents, I could see why Michael Alford and President McCullough would be attracted to the Big Ten environment and would want the the notoriety and the prestige that comes with being in a more academically focused conference. Now, your second part of your
Can I ask you a
question.
follow-up real quick, Doug, on that point?
Yeah.
And then I know Steve has a 2-point question here,
Right, yeah.
but I just want to ask real quick. Do you think in terms of the 165 million or whatever it's going to be in a year or 250 million, do you think that's I don't call it a no-brainer, but do you think that's a massive hurdle for FSU, or do you think whenever they're ready for the other reasons, AAU, landing spot, all that kind of stuff, the money it'll be there when they need it type of thing?
I did not have a lot of inside connections when this started. I haven't gotten a lot of inside information since the saga has gone on over the last year. One thing that I am very certain of is the athletic department had set aside at least $100 million before this even started.
Okay.
So we were prepared, I believe, to have reached a settlement of around $200 million to be out within 12 to 24 months. I think the ACC lowered that number, that figure, in exchange for a agreement that Florida State would remain longer. And that was another prediction that I had made in one of those shows. The ACC favors another year of Florida State more than they favor the money. That money does not tie them to survival. So I've always said they would exchange a lower payout for a longer guaranteed time with the ACC participation. So yes, the number is doable at 165. I just don't think the Big Ten or the SEC has an appetite to make a 2026 change. They're still waiting for the dust to settle on the last round. They don't have a new TV contract, and their current partners are going to want FSU to fly a kite if they want to come in as a full share. So why not buy our time? The number is high enough. I actually said in one of my tweets, I was shocked at the $15 million number because I knew there was no way mathematically to get to that number unless ESPN paid more or the member institutions took less. And I didn't think in my wildest dreams that the member institutions would agree to a haircut. So that's why the number is shocking, but it does put Florida State more on par, or close the gap anyway, to those SEC and Big Ten schools for at least the next 4 to 5 years.
Right.
So to Steve's second question.
Yes.
As an attorney, I'm not disappointed because I never had any expectation that a judge would issue a ruling that was probative or related to a determinational ruling on any of these issues. I said from the first recording with TJ, the first time we ever hopped on, this was going to resolve in a settlement. This was going to get resolved before it got inside a courtroom for any realistic analysis. This was never going to be presented to a jury. And so for that reason, I never got my hopes up or got to the point where I thought we would get some rulings from the judge on any of these issues.
Well, then you can't get let down. So well done.
Precisely.
Hey, one last thing I want to just bring up. I know we're short on time here, and I am not a Big Ten guy, but this was brought up to me on X today, and I believe there was reporting a few years ago. I know McMurphy was one of them, but they talked about an escalator clause within the Big Ten media agreement. So again, I can't go into a deep dive right now, but to get back to what you were saying there, Doug, a little bit ago in terms of this kind of interim period, and is the Big Ten or the media providers gonna kind of pony up money for FSU or whomever? I did just want to throw out there, there's this escalator clause. Again, I don't know enough about it. Something that I will definitely be doing a little more digging into, because it could help alleviate, some of the gap between today or 2026 and a 2030 type of departure. So just want to throw that out there. Anything else you have for Doug?
I want to give Doug basically a chance to do a closing statement here. What's the feeling of the FSU fan base right now? I mean, JY and I were active on Twitter, and we've seen a lot of Florida State fans and Miami fans kind of poking at each other. But there's just the general feeling. Is it relief? Is it celebration? Is it or is there still maybe hard feelings? And is it like, hey, why didn't you just agree to this 4 years ago? What's just the vibe in the FSU community?
you know from social media that there are a range of personalities and perspectives. When it comes down to the overall perspective, it's fairly universally jubilant. They are happy with how this resolved. Sure, you get a couple people that just never want to be happy. You have a couple people that hope for Mike Norvell's failure, even among the FSU fans, because we didn't pick the other coach for the coaching search. So I would put them in the 5% always unhappy category. They'll never be pleased. You have another 5% that might be upset that, this was all for nothing and we're still stuck in this conference. That is definitely a glass half empty perspective and mentality. And again, you will always have those types. But I've seen about 85%, 90% of the people that recognize the original terms of to depart the conference were $536 million, and it's now either 165 million on a sliding scale down to 75 million. We had people that thought there's no way we can get out before 2036. You're stuck, you're stuck, you're stuck. It's ironclad. At worst, we're talking about departing in 2030. You have people who are saying, there's no way you have a landing spot anywhere else. Nobody wants you. Those are people that just want to hate watch FSU. And I invite them to keep doing that because that increases the likelihood of our success bonus from the viewership. So for those people who have those mentalities and those issues, yes, you're always going to have a small percentage that are displeased. But for the most part, most of us are pulling receipts from all of those people who said that we were crybabies and you signed it, so you just got to suck it up. And I'm very excited about what my Twitter feed is going to look like over the next 72 hours as I start unloading the clip on some of those tweets that I've said. It is overall and unquestionably a victory for Florida State. And yes, it is a positive for the ACC because they continue to exist. And at the end of the day, the billable hour is the only thing that's undefeated. So the lawyers made their money. The lawyers got to spend their time, hashing out these novel legal concepts. They can now move on to their next cases, and the parties can go to their corners, lick their wounds, and hopefully reestablish their relationships on a working basis. But I do not think this means Florida State is an ACC partner for the long term.
Yeah, I would agree. And, everybody likes to go to the extremes. They either say FSU's getting out and the ACC is going to collapse, or FSU sticking around till 2036 and everything's hunky-dory in ACC land. In reality, guess what? I think FSU's going to get out, and I think the ACC is going to be, okay with membership. They've got their deal with ESPN. That's what you need, is that media rights provider. And they're both going to go, their own ways eventually, and everyone's going to live on. So,
and we're closer to that reality of there's the power to and everybody else. And Florida State realized that reality a couple years ago, which was really kind of what got this started. And it was inevitable. So since I'm not in the FSU community, I'll say, why the heck didn't they just agree to this 4 years ago?
This is exactly what we wanted. We asked the ACC for unequal revenue distribution. We asked the ACC to identify and delineate what the exit fee is. Now we've spent $2, $3, $4, $5 million in attorney's fees, and we have our answers.
There you go, Doug. Hey, thank you so much for giving your time to us yet again here on the Big Mountain. And you have an open invite. Whatever you want to talk about, we can talk about FSU baseball or whatever it is. Open invite to to come back on the mountain. Thanks so much.
My pleasure. Y'all take care. Have a good night.
Thanks.
Take care, Doug. Thank you.
And again, we thank Doug Rohan for joining us on the Big Mountain. We have a live episode tomorrow. We will be talking about this yet again. And we also have our interview with Mountain West Commissioner Navarez dropping tomorrow. We'll talk about that on our live episode as well. Tons of things happening in conference realignment and in the Big Ten and the Mountain West. And we've got it all for you. Thank you guys for watching this episode. Make sure you give it a like and subscribe if you like our content. We'll see you next time on the Big Mountain.